My name is Rob Ruiz. Talk about me real quick. Originally from Orlando, lived here until I was 7. Moved away, I now live in Omaha. Been living there for quite some time, and I've been back and forth between Orlando and Omaha pretty much most of my life. So that's just an interesting little tidbit. I got to come down here and talk to you guys. This will be the first WordCamp, actually first WordPress anything in Orlando I've ever done. So it's kind of cool. I'm the head organizer for WP Omaha, meetup group in Omaha. Co-organizer of Wordcamp Omaha for going on 3 years now. I'll be the lead organizer of it this coming year. I'm the owner of a company called Bizzle Designs. We do anything from corporate branding to web development. Nowadays, mostly websites and custom plugin development. I'm a full-time WordPress dev at a company called Orion Advisor Services, which is a subsidiary of a financial company called Northstar. We basically build a suite of software web-based software applications for investment advisors. If you don't know what an investment advisor is or an RIA, it's probably because you're like me and don't have enough money to really worry about that. But yeah, that's where I work full-time. Love it. Great company to work for. They're the reason I'm here, actually. So I'm an instructor at a trade school in Omaha called Interface Web School. And then on the side, I also do a lot of music production, DJing, recording, stuff like that, really into music. And I'm pretty awesome at StarCraft 2. If anybody here plays StarCraft 2, get it with me afterwards. We'll exchange BattleNet IDs. We can get down. I'm pretty unforgiving, though, in that game. All right, so how many people here actually well, first of all, how many people here actually code PHP? Hoping to see a lot of hands. Okay, good. If you don't, I don't know, we're going to get 0 to 100 pretty quick here. So I guess if you got questions, save them for the end. If you're not really familiar with PHP. If you are familiar with PHP, just feel free to pop your hands up at any time. So we're going to talk about using PHP to integrate with basically any API in existence. The biggest reasons why I got hired at Orion Advisor Services because they have very robust API, and so they needed somebody to do custom WordPress stuff that communicated with their API. I already had experience in that, so I've done quite a few API integration plugins, and you'll be seeing some of those today. So for those of you that aren't familiar with what an API is, and if you are, bear with me for the first 5 or 10 minutes of this. We're gonna just make sure everybody's on the same page here. It's an application program interface. So essentially what it is the common language that your application can speak with any other web application, regardless of what programming language either application was written in. So .NET can talk to PHP and can talk to JavaScript and can talk to Node and whatever. It doesn't, Ruby, you name it, right? The API is like the common, I guess, like English in a sense. If you were to think of how English has been used all over the world, it's like the main business language or whatever, no matter what country you're in. It's kind of what APIs are and JSON and whatnot. So basically we're just talking about integration between systems, web systems, and it's all done through HTTP requests and endpoints. And if you're not familiar with what an endpoint is, it's not much different than what a regular URL is. If you've ever typed a URL into your browser and hit enter and gone to a website, you've actually engaged in an HTTP request to some extent. So a lot of big web services have APIs. Small services have APIs. Chances are, if you ever find yourself asking yourself if a system or a web application has an API, I would say 9 times out of 10 they probably do have a REST API. And chances are you can integrate with that REST API to get data and automate all sorts of fun stuff using WordPress in this case. So this is kind of how it works. You know, you've got the server, you've got the API in the middle, and then that API essentially handles your requests and then delivers the data back and forth between the two. So it's just an intermediary to a certain extent, almost like a translator, if you will. And it's just going to help you either get or change the data on the database that exists on the server from any one of these devices down here, any client-side application, processing device, a browser, an app, you name it, your TV, your car, washing machine, anything, video game. All right, so we're going to quickly go over kind of like the base functions that are used whenever you use WordPress to communicate with an API. You got WP Remote Get, WP Remote Post, WP Remote Head, and then your WP Remote Request. You'll see some code examples later that will use these. The first two are very specific, and the last one is more generic. That's the easiest way I like to sum these up. So if you know for certain they're always going to be just getting data, you're always just going to be doing a GET request to wherever, then you can just use the WP Remote GET. However, I'm going to show you a way later where you can essentially write a class and a method that is more flexible than that. And in that case, we will be using the WP Remote Request so that we can simply pass the method in as an argument to the method, how do I want to word this? We're passing an argument into the method that will essentially automatically perform one of these and communicate with our API. So obviously, once we hit an endpoint, it's going to give us something. Hopefully, it's the data we're expecting to get. It's not always that, especially when you're first getting started. You're probably going to hit it incorrectly a few times, so you're always going to have to do error handling and whatnot. But essentially, we're going to be using these functions whenever we do any of that. So the WP Remote Retrieve Body is a really cool helper function built into WordPress that essentially takes any response and just automatically grabs the body out and gives you just that, and what you get back is going to vary depending on what API you're hitting, and you're always going to have to look up API documentation for that specific API to know what you're going to be getting. But most of the times, the bulk of your data is going to be in the body of the response, and so this thing, WP Remote Retrieve Body, will very efficiently and easily suck out the main thing that you want and just give you that. The next thing is the WP Remote Retrieve Response code. This is the error handling part, and you'll see how we kind of use this later when I go over some example code. Essentially, we're going to use that to just write some conditionals to handle, what we do in the case that we receive anything other than a 200, which is successful response. There's some other handy ones down there at the bottom. WP Remote Retrieve Header, WP Remote Retrieve Response Message. Those can be handy as well when you're dealing with error handling. So we got a lot of requests, a lot of responses, and you can easily just start throwing these functions in there and start giving it what it expects and look the functions up in the WordPress codex and get what you want. But what we're going to kind of be going over here is how do we create a nice, efficient system to handle these that can kind of be duplicated and used for any API that you're trying to connect to no matter what, to kind of give us something that's easy to deal with, kind of like an interface, if you will. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to write a class that manages all these requests for us, and then we're going to develop that class into a bunch of methods that we can then call from anywhere in our code. And you'll kind of see what I'm talking about here in a second. So here's an example of a class. It's kind of obvious which parts are going to be, you're going to go in and clean this code up a bit to match whatever it is you're trying to write at that given time. But this is how I like to do it whenever I'm writing a plugin. So obviously we would instantiate this class in our code somewhere, and I'm not really going to go into object-oriented programming or how to instantiate classes or anything like that. So if you want to learn about that, you're going to have to go do that on your own. We don't really got time to go over that. It's kind of outside of the scope. But we write a class, we write a method, and that method is simply called request, and then we're just going to pass we're just going to pass some parameters in, and the parameters are the endpoint and the method. Now, if we're just requesting data, we could simply not pass the method in. And that's why I've set the get string as the method by default. So really you only have to pass the endpoint in this when you use this method. You don't really have to pass the second parameter in because it's just going to do get by default. Does that make sense? Have I gone over anybody's head yet? I told you 0 to 100 real quick. Like, we're not going to waste any time. I want to leave a lot of time for questions and answers and code and stuff later. So basically, yeah, we can get away with just passing the endpoint in as a string, and it's just going to perform the get requests. So we'll go over this line by line just real quick. So you got your URL that just builds the URL. We pass in the args that supplies the method because we're going to use the WP remote request instead of WP remote get so that we can tell it to perform any kind of request that we want, although usually it's going to be get. And then essentially what we're going to do is we're just going to grab the response code out, and then we're just going to do a little bit of error handling here. Now, this is going to expand depending on what exactly you're trying to do with the data that you get back from your endpoint request. But this is like the bare bones minimum, essentially. Like, all we're doing is we're saying if the response code is equal to 200, which means there was no errors, then basically get the body out from the request and JSON decode it and turn it into PHP data is essentially what we're doing. And then we're returning that so that we end up getting a PHP object instead of a JavaScript object wherever we're calling this method. Yes?
Is there a library or errors? Or is it just, it's an error or not?
There is a library of different types of errors. You just have to Google it, and that's all just HTTP standards. So I think on a few, what's going on here? Did my computer freeze up? Apparently it did. Okay, we'll give it a few seconds and see if it comes back to life. Usually it does. So there's some examples on like 2 slides ago that kind of shows a few different, like 500 is a common internal server error, 401 is an unauthorized error, and these are just common HTTP error classes. You can go look them up in a library, and it's completely agnostic of WordPress or PHP or whatever. Of course, we're not going to be go any farther if my computer doesn't feel like coming back to life. There we go. I told you. Okay. So that's in the case we just want to get data from an API. What if we want to update data somewhere if we have the authorization? Now, we're not going to talk about authorization quite yet, but before we go and look at this any further, I just want to point out what might be obvious to some of you, which is if you're going to update data on an API, they're likely going to ask for some kind of authorization so that not anybody can go and just change data on their API. So you don't see any authorization being handled in here, but I just didn't want to get into it at this point in time during the thing because I'm kind of trying to simplify things. But just know that likely you would have to deal with authorization here, and how that would be dealt with is you're simply going to pass it in the args. You see where I'm saying args equals array, and then it says method and body. There would be another parameter you pass in that array that would essentially be called headers, and then you would pass it in the headers. Usually it's authorization space and then some string or token or whatever. I don't know, different. And the other reason I didn't want to talk about it here is because different APIs handle it differently. Some APIs will handle the authorization in the URL, so you'll pass like a key or a token in the endpoint. Others ask for you to pass it in the headers, and so, like I said, you're just going to have anytime you write a plugin that interacts with a third-party API, you're always going to have to look up the documentation for that API and see what they're expecting to get. So yeah, and here we're doing the same exact thing on the last one, except notice that our default instead of get is post now. And I would say it's more important to make sure that you're using WP remote request instead of WP remote get or WP remote post in this method instead of the last method, because in this method you don't know if an API is going to expect a post or a put when it comes to updating. So it's nice to be able to pass either one in here variably. And again, we're passing posts as default. So if it's just a post, all we need to put in is the endpoint and the body. If they're expecting a put, then all we got to do is say comma, not parentheses, ticks or quotes, put in all caps, and just pass that put method in. Any questions on this so far? Because this is kind of like the bulk of, this is the simplest, like, main working parts. This is kind of like our left foot and our right foot, if you will, of handling API requests with WordPress. Everything else is going to kind of like spread off of this. Any questions whatsoever on anything? You guys sure? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Is there any overhead using the WordPress functions instead of, using like native PHP functions like curl?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, when you follow this down the tree a bit in WordPress, you're performing curl requests in the end anyway. This just makes it simpler for you. So could you use curl instead of this? Absolutely. But since you're using WordPress, WordPress is a framework, and this framework just happens to have a bunch of helper functions already built into it. It's a convenience type thing. And so in my opinion, there's no reason to not use the WordPress functions instead of curl, because it just makes your code cleaner, and it's essentially doing the same thing. In terms of performance, if you wanted to break it down to like the microseconds, or is there a what's smaller than a millisecond? I mean, a nanosecond, sure, yeah. It's going to be nanoseconds of difference, I'm sure. I mean, it's PHP, it's a server, it's fast. Okay, so this is kind of an example of how we would use one of those classes in our code to get data, essentially. So let's pretend at this point we've already written those classes and methods. They already exist. And let's just pretend this is like in a page template, or maybe this code is in a widget or something. It doesn't really matter where this code from here on out gets written, because you can write it anywhere. So we're just saying get data, Acme API is just a reference to the class, request Acme API is a reference to the method, and then we're passing in our endpoint here between those single quotes. And then all I'm doing here is I'm just doing a print R. What you do instead of the print R is up to you entirely. And we'll see some live code examples here soon, and you'll see what I did with that data instead of obviously print R. All print R is going to do is just give us that object and spit it all out on the page. Most times what you want to do is grab specific little pieces of it or loop through it or something. And so, yeah, I just want to make sure that's clear. Now, if you're performing a series of requests or posts, then there's kind of a different way to do it that I like to do anyway. And I'm not saying this is like best practice or anything. I'm just saying this is my little method that's worked well for me, because I do a lot of API integration stuff with WordPress. Maybe somebody knows a better way. If you do, I'd be interested to hear it. But yeah, all I'm doing is, instead of calling the class and method directly, is I'm essentially creating a new object and passing it into a variable, and then I'm just calling that variable later on down the line, so that instead of having to constantly call the class and the method, I can essentially create the object, pass it into a variable, and then call the methods off of that object later on in a sequence of calls. And when you're doing API stuff, especially when it comes to updating stuff on an API, very frequently you have to do series of requests instead of just a single request. So that's not uncommon. Okay, so let's see here. I don't want to read this word for word here. You guys can read yourselves if you're interested. But basically what we're going to go into here is, what we've talked about so far is great if we're just building a page. So when I say building a page, I mean like all of this stuff is happening before we actually see the page, just like any other PHP, right? PHP is going through, it's reading everything, it's building the page, and then it spits out a bunch of HTML as we perform the GET request for that page. Or let's say it's a widget or something, it's going to put that widget somewhere. That's all good and fine if we're doing it beforehand, and the server, is doing it before you're even interacting with the page, essentially. So what if you want to do this stuff after the page is loaded and during user interactions? Because that's very common. At least I found that very common when I started doing this type of stuff. Is, okay, that's great, I loaded the page, but I don't want to have to constantly reload the page every time a user clicks on a button or does whatever. I want it to be real time so that there's no page reloads, and it just sends requests, get requests, boom, 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 boom. And then, so now we're talking about Ajax, right? How many people are familiar with performing Ajax requests in here? Okay, good. So, yeah, there is an Ajax function, and this is going to get kind of weird here, so if I lose anybody, please raise your hand. So from the browser, and I don't know if, has anybody ever tried to do this, like perform an Ajax request using jQuery to a different domain and failed, not been able to do it successfully? Okay, we're going to talk about why that's difficult and how to get around that problem is essentially what we're getting at here. So yeah, we can, jQuery is built into WordPress, and we can just call .ajax to perform an HTTP request, and we can give it whatever URL we want, right? But here's what's going to happen, is that unless you're calling Ajax to your own URL, to your own server, which you do a lot, I do a lot, it's going to give you many times a CORS error. Okay? CORS stands for cross-origin request sharing. Now, this isn't always the case, and this is where things get kind of weird, because it's all about what if this, what if that, different APIs work differently or whatever, right? Some APIs are set up to handle CORS requests, other APIs are not. And so, yeah, depending on the API, sure, you can just do a jQuery Ajax and hit an HTTP endpoint as long as you're passing it all the right stuff. Most times you're going to have to pass a token or some kind of authorization with that to handle the CORS. Otherwise, it'll block it. And I don't know, it gets all weird. But essentially, I found, and I'm sure many other people have found, an easy way to get around this problem. And so essentially what we're going to do is instead of calling that URL specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to Ajax to our own server, because we know we can do that. We know we're not going to get a problem because it's not cross-domain. It's still in the same domain, right? But we're just going to call, nowadays, we're going to call the REST API. We're going to create an endpoint in the REST API for us, for this Ajax request. And then once we hit that Ajax request, then we're just going to process, we're going to have our server call the other server, and then that solves the CORS problem. Did I lose anybody? Raise your hand if I did. It's okay. Okay, so we're kind of going around, we're doing like a, what do you call, around the rosy type little situation here, where we gotta tell this person to talk to that person because we can't talk to them directly because we're not friends for some reason. And we say, okay, you tell them, it's like that scene in the Harry Potter movie when it's like him, Harry and his buddy get mad at each other. And anyway, yeah, she gets mad, she says, I'm not an owl or whatever, yeah. So it's that type of thing. We have to tell our server to call the other server, then that request goes back to our server, and then our server gives us back the response, and then that's how we deal with it. I have a whole talk I just did 2 months ago in Omaha, at WordCamp Omaha, that talks specifically about how to perform Ajax requests with the REST API. The YouTube video is already up, and so you can go watch that if you want to learn how to use the REST API to look up or to perform Ajax requests in this fashion. So I'm not going to go into that anymore because we got a lot of more stuff to cover. We're already 25 minutes in. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about authentication. How many people were, I know like the description says we're going to go into oAuth and all this stuff, right? How many people were actually interested in that part of it? I'm guessing it's very few people, but okay. We're going to talk about that a little bit. We're not going to talk about it a lot because there's a gajillion different ways to use oAuth. And oAuth is kind of like its own other talk, and it's not even WordPress specific at all. But I did want to cover it because very frequently when you're doing API integration stuff, you have to worry about authentication, and usually it's the most boring, mundane part of writing API integration systems. Once you're past authentication, usually you can write things to where, you know, it just gets handled automatically once you get through that first part. But yeah, it is essential to do authentication when you're integrating with APIs that aren't open, if you're dealing with private data or whatever, right? So you've got your app level and your user level authentication. And this is, I'm getting very, very like generic here. I'm sure you could break it down into way more types than this. Again, every API is different, but these are the two most common things that I've found. If you need app level data, if you just need basic data from an API, and you're saying, okay, look, I've got an account with this web service, and I just need to know this public data that anybody can access if they go to some URL and look for it. I know it's public. It's not information about my user. It's just information about whatever on this website. Most times they're just going to provide you an API key on the app level. And they're going to have you include that either in the authorization or in the endpoint or whatever. And that's easy. Those things are easy. You're going to see some code here soon that talks specifically about that. What's not easy is the user level stuff. And so this is where we get into SSO, or single sign-on, if you're not familiar with what that is. And so this gets a lot trickier and a lot more complicated. I'm going to touch on this, but I really don't want to dive too deep because that is a deep rabbit hole, and half of you, if not more, will fall asleep while we're in that rabbit hole. So like I said, I'll touch on it so that you guys know how to go find some more information on your own, or if you want to ask me more about it after this, I'd be more than happy to get deep in the rabbit hole with you, but we won't do that now. Okay, so, and then this is the rest of this talk, which I originally had that included the REST API. However, I realized that somebody else is talking about REST API stuff like right down the hall from us right now, Zach Gordon, I think, and I was in there earlier and it sounded fascinating. So I had to come do this talk. Had I not had to do this talk, I would have stayed in there. It sounds like he definitely knows what he's talking about. So I figured it would be kind of weird to go into the REST API and talk about both sides of it. If you want more information about how the REST API works, you can watch that YouTube video that I just gave you the link for earlier, or just come up and talk to me. I'd be more than happy to talk about REST API stuff. But I figured for this, we're just going to talk more about interacting with other APIs instead of allowing other APIs to interact with WordPress, because that'll turn this into a 2-hour-long talk instead of a 1-hour-long talk. So yeah, so there's a little bit about that, blah, 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 whatever. Okay, cool, we're done. All right, so that's the end of our slideshow, and we're going to go on to more fun stuff, which is actually code examples. So I recently started putting together a website for WP Omaha, which is our WordPress users group in Omaha. And I did not want to put a lot of time into this because I do not get paid anything to do this. As many of the WordCamp people here, the organizers probably know, we don't get paid to do this stuff. So the fact that I put this much work into it is cool enough. But anyway, what I wanted was, I wanted the ability to be able to display stuff from meetup.com on this site that we're building. And there were some plugins out there that already did it for me or whatever, but it wasn't exactly what I wanted. And then some other ones costed money, and I'm like, I'm not going to pay money for something that I could do myself, especially since this is a free thing, community thing. So I just said, okay, well, I made like a little class out of it, and I taught some people API integration in a class, and then we kind of wrote this plugin together. So now we have our own little plugin, which I'll show you guys the code for here. And then basically what we're doing is we're using the meetup.com API, REST API, to do a couple of different things here. One is to show this little thing up here that shows the very next meetup, and these two things are separate, so don't get them confused. But I wanted to, no matter what part of the website you were in, to always show what the next meetup was going to be in the header, so that they would always be able to see that no matter where they were in the site. And then on the home page, or I guess in any page that has this widget on it, I created a widget that just shows the X amount of upcoming events from our group. And we can dictate that in the widget, and I'll kind of show you guys that too. And then I'll show you how I coded it. Any questions before we dive into code? I don't want to get too far off here. Look at some code, basically show you exactly how I wrote this, and then if you guys got questions then, okay? So let's open this up. So this is the plugin here that we're seeing. I'm sorry, I'm sure it's kind of small for the people in the back. When we actually open the code here, I'll try to zoom in as much as possible so you can see. Unfortunately, I can't zoom in on the left side here, but I will be putting this plugin up on a public repository on GitHub. So if you're interested in just like downloading this and messing with it, it will be available for you to do that. But essentially what we have here is we have, let me see if I can remember how I coded this. Just go into the main plugin file here, open this. Some of this has to do with the settings. I used a settings, anybody here familiar with settings frameworks? Anybody here ever used a settings framework to develop a plugin? I would highly recommend it. Redux is probably the most commonly used, but it is a very massive framework that's more designed for like themes. If you've ever bought a premium theme off of ThemeForest, you'd probably use Redux. I ended up using another one called S214. Both were developed kind of by the same person who actually started WordPress Omaha and was one of the first people to do WordCamp Omaha. And these two are now like the most commonly used options frameworks for WordPress in existence. So if you're looking for a smaller, lighter options framework for your plugin that you're developing, S214 is a great one. Otherwise, if you're developing like a big, huge professional theme that has a whole bunch of options, Redux is really, really cool. So if you've never looked into either of those, I highly recommend it. But in this case, we use S214, which is basically all this is up here. It's just configuring S214 and setting up some files to make sure that we can have all of our options set up. But then down here, you'll see this main class that I was talking about in the slides earlier, okay? So I basically just created a class called MUFWPG that stands for Meetup for WordPress Groups. I didn't know what else to call it. I just wanted to keep it small and short and simple. I basically have the base URL for Meetup statically coded in here. Then we're calling in some options, and we're essentially just instantiating some variables here. Let me zoom in on this so people in the back can see. You guys see it all right back there? You guys good? The lighting situation's a bit bright, but.
Can you turn WordWrap on as well?
There's a presentation on this. Is it Feature Storm?
I'm sorry?
Is it Feature Storm?
Yeah.
There's a presentation on it.
Is there?
Yeah.
Do you know how to?
View menu. Third from the bottom.
Oh. You are the superhero today at the superhero-themed WordCamp. Congratulations. All right, thank you for that. I just learned something. Actually, I've learned like 5 new things today. All right, so now basically what we got here now, we're not updating any data on Meetup. We're just trying to pull it off there. So I didn't make like an update Meetup method, but I did use this request Meetup method to do everything else on here. And you can see it's essentially, it's written exactly like my example code. So the only difference is we've got the method first instead of the endpoint. It really doesn't matter which way you do it. Yeah, whatever. So you got get, endpoint, and then I leave the token in there. It's optional. We don't necessarily need to have it. I just kind of write it in always because I don't know if I'm going to need it or not. And in this case, I'm just not using it. So we could just remove this token. It wouldn't really matter. The big thing there is the endpoint and the method. Let me zoom in. Can I zoom in? And yes. OK, cool. But that still doesn't give us the word wrap. OK, so let's go over how we're structuring this URL, because when it comes to this specific API, this part is probably the most important. Other APIs work differently, and they wouldn't be as important, but this one it is. So all we're doing is we're saying this Meetup base URL concatenated with the endpoint, concatenated with the key, and then it goes into our options framework and pulls out the options that we entered into the plugin, which is our key. So basically I use the options framework to make a place in the back end of WordPress that we can copy and paste our key into and save it in the database in the options table. And then it pulls that key into there. And that's how this specific API works, is it says, okay, if you just need the basic like public data interaction, you can just take a key that we generate automatically for you and concatenated it into any URL for any endpoint that you hit, I guess URI in this case. And then that is essentially your authentication. So if you don't have that key in there, you're going to get your 401 unauthorized. But as long as you got your key in there and your key checks out when we hit the endpoint, then we're good. And then the rest of it is like almost exactly like what I showed you in the slides, right? So we're just grabbing the request. When we do the remote request, we're putting it into this variable. We're passing this variable into the response code thing, getting the response code, making sure it checked out. Then we're taking the body, JSON decoding it, passing it back in the response, and then that's that. Okay? And then I will show you. Hopefully I just hit escape to go back to the other view. No? There we go. Almost. Now how do I get back to my other view is the question.
Oh, there's an exit, yeah. Same thing. View for the exit.
Sweet. Except I've lost my, where's my file tree at? Toolbar?
View tool Windows project. There's one on there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just started using PHP Storm like a year ago, so I haven't like explored all the little ins and outs of it. So if we go into, let's see, how did I do this? JS, CSS, okay. Somewhere I wrote configured the actual widget. I don't remember where though. No, this is all that. Settings stuff. I don't remember where my widget code is. I wonder if I wrote it somewhere else. That's unfortunate. I think I wrote it somewhere else and I don't have it on here. I was going to show you guys like the actual widget and where it pulls that in. I could probably go into the back end and show you from there. Let's just log in here. I'll just show you guys the configurations real quick so you can see how this works. Is there any questions over this so far? Like how we're doing this very simple, like probably the simplest way possible to do an API call? No questions? You guys got it? I'm really good at explaining stuff apparently. Okay. Yeah, so if we go into settings and meet up for WP groups, this is where we're doing all of that. And then I've got something that is messed up in here because it's automatically filling in my username and password in here instead of the existing API key, but the API key is saved in the database. So normally I would just show you the API key there. And then let's go ahead and see if I can find that plugin code in the actual plugins, because I do kind of want to show you where in the widget we're calling the hopefully we can get to it from here. Yeah, here we go. Whoa. I'm just going to spit this into a new file in here. I don't know why it's not on this laptop, but okay. Let's see if we can master the art of using this presentation mode. So all I'm doing is building a widget. If you've never built a widget with WordPress, we won't get into all that, but this is how you do it, if you're curious. So all we're doing is building a widget, and then whenever this widget gets spit out on it, or whenever we instantiate the widget, all we're doing is we're instantiating our class that we wrote. We're passing the whole class into this variable, and then we're just saying, get me all the next events. We're doing that by using the request MU. We're saying get, hit the events endpoint in this case, and then all we're doing is we're going to loop through these now. And we're just going to loop through them for the amount of times that they've set in the widget. So we're just saying, okay, the widget has a setting that says how many events do you want to show in this widget. We're just getting whatever's set in there, and we're passing it into this for loop, right? So we're just saying, okay, give me the event count -1, and then for every single one of those, spit it out on the page. So actually, when it gets the response back from the request, it's getting the full list of events, but then we're only echoing out X amount of them on the front end. So in this case, if we were to look at the widget settings for that event thing, let's see if I can gracefully get back to where I was before. You said view, tool windows, no. Toolbar, what was it again?
I'll just do an exit first. Third arrow from the bottom.
It's like 3 steps though.
Yeah, better than mine.
And then
Tool windows.
project, yeah, okay, gotcha. So if we go into appearance and widgets and look where I put that widget in here, you'll see that setting. I think I created a custom place called home right. There it is. And so here I've got 5 set in there. So all it's doing is saying whatever numbers and set in this field, spit out that many, and then that's how we end up with this right here. And then I just added some styling and stuff. So that's a really, really simple API integration. Any questions on that? Because we're gonna, since we've got, I'm gonna try and take another 5 minutes to quickly go over how I do oAuth. How many people are curious about the oAuth part? Okay. I'm gonna go through this really fast, so get ready. Okay, we're not doing it there, but where we are doing it is okay. So this is gonna get kind of crazy, just bear with me. Okay, so every API is different. The way our API works and the way we do authentication is first we ask you to hit a specific endpoint and we ask you to pass some args. I'm going to use the presentation mode again, which is going to kind of annoy me but is better. Okay, cool. So here's what we're doing. We're calling this function called getRefresh. This is how we get a refresh token. A refresh token is what we use to get an access token. The access token is what we use to perform all of our calls. So a refresh token is a token that gets us an access token. If that's not confusing enough for you, we'll find something else more confusing later, but that's pretty confusing to me. So what we're doing to get the refresh token is we're saying, okay, we're going to pass in the headers, our authorization, and then we're making this string essentially that says basic, and then we're base64 encoding our username and our password with a colon together. We make this request to the API. It gives us back our refresh token. Then what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, as long as we're all good and we didn't get any errors or anything there, we're calling this method called setPertunis. I'm not going to go into what Pertunis is. It's nerdy. But basically, I'm calling this method that says take the refresh token that I got and save it in the database in the options, so that this plugin can now use that refresh token to get an access token at any point in time in the future. Then we have another method, I guess. It's not a function because it's in a class or whatever, called Access Orion. And what Access Orion says is it says, okay, now we need to pass another call where we say bearer and we pass the refresh token. When we do this with our client ID and our client secret, it gives us back a actual access token. And that access token is only legit for up to 10 hours, I think, which is why we need the refresh token. The refresh token never expires, where the access token does. And so this thing, I'm using transients. Anybody here ever used transients before? Transients are pretty awesome, not just for caching, by the way. And so you'll see why it's not just for caching right here. What I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, check for this transient called Orion Access, and if you don't find it, then go get it and make it. And if it's there, then don't do this. Just get whatever's in the transient. So I'm caching my token, if that makes any sense. I thought that was a pretty cool usage of it. Anyway, yeah, so this is how we get our access token. Once we have our access token, we're putting it somewhere where we can easily grab it, which is in this method itself, because it's just checking for the transient and grabbing the transient if it's there. And then so now anywhere else in my code where I need to call Orion, I just say, hey, just request Orion. And it's that request Orion is going to get me the token. And it's actually, it's going to get the token if I don't have it, and then it's going to do all the authorization for me, essentially. So if we look at request Orion, where'd it go? Get refresh, access Orion, boom. All it's doing is saying, okay, get me the token if you don't already have it, and then if you got it, then perform this API call. And then we're doing the same thing we just talked about in the very beginning of this presentation. We're creating API requests, but automatically using the authorization. Was that 5 minutes? It was 5 minutes. I'm actually kind of impressed I did that. Cool. Any questions about oAuth?
Do you guys configure your own oAuth server and authentication?
Yes. It already was in existence when I started working there. They just told me how to work with it.
What is that? Is it a PHP service that you're running that with, like WP Omaha?
No, it's a .NET. It's a .NET SQL, crazy, huge, like, whatever, industry style API. Any other questions about oAuth, API requests, how to do API integrations of any kind? No? No way it can be that good. All right, well, if you do have any questions and you just don't want to ask them right now, I'll be standing up here for the next 10 minutes, okay? Allows you to automatically feed Wistia videos into your WordPress website if you use Wistia.
What's your Twitter handle, sir?
Bizzle Design.